The safest thing you own is only as safe as the rules that govern it. And in this country, those rules have been rewritten overnight before, with the stroke of a single pen, while ordinary people were asleep and had no idea it was coming. That is the shock the smart money is quietly bracing for, and it is the reason I want to talk to you plainly today. Not a jackboot at your door tomorrow, something older, quieter, and far more likely. Because the last time American savers got blindsided, it was not a market crash that did it, and it was not a foreign invasion. It was a piece of paper signed in Washington that changed what their savings were worth by decree and moved most of them out of the way right before the value shifted. If you own physical gold and silver right now, you need to understand exactly how that trick worked, because the setup rhymes with today more than the financial channels will ever tell you. So let me give you the honest answer up front, before I prove a word of it. Bullion owners are exposed. That part of the title is true, and I am not going to soften it to make you comfortable. But the danger is not that men in dark suits are coming to pry the coins out of your safe. The real exposure is that the framework around your savings, the tax treatment, the rules about what you can hold and how, the promises attached to the paper you trust, are political objects. They can be changed. They have been changed. And the people who came out ahead the last time were not the ones who did everything right and trusted the system. They were the ones who understood the game and positioned before the rule changed, instead of after. Here is the concrete piece of history that should stop you in your tracks. In the depths of the Great Depression, the federal government ordered private citizens to hand in their gold, not suggested, ordered, under Executive Order 6102, backed by the threat of a heavy fine and time in a federal prison. Regular people carried their coins and their bars into the bank and turned them over because the law told them to, and they were law-abiding folks. And then, once the public had been separated from the metal, the government revalued gold sharply higher. The citizens got the old price on the way out. The government captured the gain on the way up. That is the whole story of how a saver can do nothing wrong and still be left holding the short end. Let me put real numbers on it, because the specifics are what make it land. The people who turned their gold in were paid right around $20.67 an ounce. Shortly after, under the Gold Reserve Act, the official price of gold was set at $35 an ounce. That is a jump of roughly 69%, handed to the Treasury, taken from the pockets of the very people who had just complied. Think about that. The value did not vanish. It was transferred from the trusting citizen to the institution that wrote the rule. And it all happened in a window so short that by the time anyone understood what had occurred, the door had already closed behind them. Now, in my years in the gold and silver world, sitting with people who spent a lifetime building something and are terrified of one wrong move, I have watched this fear get twisted into exactly the wrong reaction. People hear a story like this and their gut says sell, get liquid, get out before it happens to me. And that instinct is precisely what the big banks and the trading desks are counting on. Understand who profits when a frightened retiree dumps real metal back into the market. The churn is their business. The house makes its money on your panic, not on your patience. So the financial media will happily amplify the scary headline and stay dead silent on the one lesson that actually protects you. That silence is not an accident. It is the business model. Because here is what the history really teaches, and it is the opposite of run. The move against savers did not target the metal in a man's own hands so much as it targeted the system he was plugged into. When your wealth sits as an entry in someone else's ledger, a number on a statement, a promise from an institution, that promise can be rewritten by whoever controls the ledger. The gold that got revalued was the gold inside the system. And the entire point, the thing almost nobody connects, is that owning the real thing in a structure you actually control is what keeps you from being the one who gets moved out of the way. And that is not even the most unsettling part, because you do not have to reach back generations to see this exact mechanism fire. Look at what happened when a major world power had its official reserves frozen a few years back. Hundreds of billions of dollars in savings, held the modern way, as claims and promises parked in other people's systems, were switched off with a keystroke. Gone. Not stolen in the street, deactivated by decree. The same fundamental move as before, just wearing a newer suit. And the central banks of the world watched that happen and drew the obvious conclusion. They went out and bought gold at a pace we had not seen in generations, because the one asset that cannot be frozen, cannot be switched off, and doesn't depend on anyone else keeping a promise is metal sitting in your own vault. And that brings me to something I need to put in front of you right now, because it grows straight out of everything I just said. If that lesson landed, the reserve freeze lesson, that wealth held as someone else's promise can be switched off with a keystroke, while metal in your own possession cannot, then you owe it to yourself to understand how to move a portion of what you have out of pure paper and into something you actually hold. That is exactly why my family and I put together the free Retirement Wealth Protection Guide. It walks through, in plain language, how American retirees can diversify a portion of their retirement savings into physical gold and silver, held inside the account they already have without triggering taxes or penalties, using what is called a self-directed precious metals IRA. This is not just for insiders or the wealthy. If you have $100,000 or more in any retirement account, a 401k, an IRA, whatever you built, this is for you. From our family to yours, no obligation and nothing to buy. If you are watching this on your television, just scan the QR code on your screen. If you are on your phone or your computer, go to readfamilyguide.com. Get it, read it, and at least know your options before anyone changes the rules on you. Now let me bring this home, off the history books and onto a real American kitchen table. Picture a retired dairy farmer up in Wisconsin. He worked his whole life, milked in the dark and milked in the cold, sold the herd when his knees gave out, and put what he had into a retirement account like a responsible man. His own father used to tell him the story of the gold hand-in, how neighbors lined up at the county bank and turned in their coins because a good citizen followed the law. That old man never forgot the lesson, that the rules can change, and the folks who trust the most can lose the most. So the farmer keeps a little metal, but most of what he has still sits in the system, in paper, in promises, in numbers on a screen that somebody else controls. He is not reckless. He is exposed, and he does not fully see it. That man is who I am talking to. That man is probably a lot like you. And here is where it gets genuinely strange, because the setup today has a wrinkle that generation never faced. The people who run the money are not hiding their own move. Gold has quietly climbed past the other great reserve assets to sit near the very top of what the world's central banks choose to hold, ahead of the currencies that used to be considered untouchable. These are the most informed, best resourced buyers on the planet, and they have spent years accumulating the one thing that carries no counterparty, no politics, and no off switch. They bought at a record clip for several years running. That buying has cooled and turned choppy lately. I will be honest with you about that. It is not a straight line, and I would never pretend it is. But the direction of travel is unmistakable. The insiders are voting with their reserves, and they are voting for metal you can hold. Let me widen the lens to silver for a moment, because silver carries this same story with an industrial twist that makes it even harder to fake your way around. The world has been pulling more silver out of the ground than it puts back for years now, a genuine structural shortfall, because most silver is not even mined on purpose. It comes up as a byproduct when companies dig for copper and zinc and lead, so the supply does not respond quickly, no matter how tight things get. And unlike gold, which gets hoarded and sits in vaults, silver gets consumed, burned into solar panels of electronics and 1,000 industrial uses, much of it dispersed so thin it will never be economically recycled. Gold is hoarded. Silver is used up. On the paper exchanges, though, there are far more claims trading than there is metal that could ever be delivered against them, which is just another version of the same warning. A claim is a promise, and a promise is only as good as the rule behind it. And if you are tempted to think that hand-in was a one-time act of desperation that could never repeat in spirit, let me hand you a second American example, closer in time, that proves the pattern never really left. Decades later, a president stood up and told the world that the dollar would no longer be convertible into gold, that the promise the entire global system was built on was suspended. He called it temporary. It was never reversed. In a single evening, by decree, the definition of money itself was rewritten, and every saver on earth woke up holding something quietly different from what they went to bed with. Nobody voted, nobody was warned. That is the through line I need you to see. When the people in charge decide the rules of savings are inconvenient, they do not ask permission, and they do not send a notice. They act, and the public reconciles itself afterward. There is one more tell, and this one is subtle enough that most people miss it entirely, which is exactly why it is worth your attention. For a long stretch, gold behaved by a reliable rule of its own. When the return on safe government bonds went up, gold went down, because a shiny metal that pays you nothing looks worse next to a bond that suddenly pays more. That was the textbook relationship for a generation. And recently, that relationship simply broke. Gold has climbed even while those safe returns stayed stubbornly high, which under the old rules should never have happened. Why? Because the buyer at the margin changed. The nervous fund manager watching interest rates got replaced as the deciding buyer by the central banks, who do not care what a bond pays because they are not buying for yield. They are buying for safety that cannot be switched off. When the old rule stops working, it is usually because something underneath it has quietly shifted, and this shift is pointing in one direction. And look at the backdrop we are standing in while all of this plays out. The dollar has been softening. The Fed itself is openly divided, arguing with itself in public about whether it has done enough or needs to tighten further, with a real faction wanting to press harder against an inflation that has run above target for years. That is not the picture of a system in calm control. That is the picture of the people who write the rules disagreeing about what the rules should even be, which is precisely the environment in which sudden decisions get made. When the folks at the top are visibly unsure, the odds that they reach for a blunt, decisive tool go up, not down. The farmer in Wisconsin does not read the meeting minutes. He just knows, the way his father knew, that when the men in charge start fighting among themselves about money, it is time to make sure some of yours is in a form they cannot reach into. Now, I owe you the honest caution, because a guide who only tells you the exciting half is not a guide you should trust. I cannot tell you the rules will change, or when or how. A wholesale ban on ownership, like the one from the Depression, is, in my honest read, unlikely to return in that exact form, and I am not going to stand here and frighten you into a corner to make a point. This is a case built on how power has actually behaved when it gets cornered, not a prophecy and not a promise. I cannot promise you a price. Metal goes down as well as up, sometimes hard and fast when the desks push margins around and shake out the nervous holders, even when nothing real has changed underneath. Anyone who tells you they know the day or the number is either fooling you or fooling themselves. What I can tell you is durable, and it is this. Resilience is built before you need it, never during. Because watch how the shakeouts actually work, and you will stop fearing the wrong thing. Time and again, I have seen the metal get slammed lower, not because anything fundamental broke, but because the rules of the trading game got tweaked. Margins raised, leverage yanked, and the leveraged and the frightened were forced to sell into the drop. Silver has been cut hard in a matter of days on nothing but that kind of pressure. And every single time, the person who got hurt was the one holding a promise he did not understand, or the one who let a paper game dictate when he sold real metal. The person who owned the physical thing outright, sized so that no margin call and no scary headline could ever force his hand, simply held. And on the other side of the shakeout, he was still standing, while the churned out crowd was gone. Which brings me to the recognition I want you to sit with, because this is the part the news will get to last. The biggest, most sophisticated pools of money on Earth have already made this move, quietly, over years, without a single headline announcing it. The pension committees, the mainstream advisors, the folks who wait for permission from the financial channels, they have not caught up. And by the very nature of the thing, they cannot until it is already obvious to everyone. And once it is obvious to everyone, once every segment leads with it, and every advisor suddenly recommends what he mocked a year earlier, the comfortable part of this will already be behind us. Being early does not feel like winning. It feels like standing slightly apart from the crowd, a little too early, wondering if you are wrong. That discomfort is the price of admission, and it is exactly where the farmer in Wisconsin, and maybe you, get to stand right now while the door is still open. So let me be concrete about what to actually do with your own position. And I mean principles, not a prescription, because your situation is yours. Own the real thing, not a promise dressed up to look like it. Hold it in a structure you control, rather than one that can be rewritten around you. Size it so that no shakeout, no margin game, no scary week can ever force you to sell at the worst possible moment. And never, ever hand your metal back into a panic just because a headline told you to be afraid. The whole lesson of that Depression-era hand-in is that the people who followed the herd and trusted the system on the way out were the ones who got left behind on the way up. And that is the heart of why now matters, without me inventing a single fake deadline. The window where a decision like this is still cheap, still calm, and still entirely reversible is precisely the window when nothing feels urgent. Nobody is pounding on the table. There is no crisis on the screen forcing your hand. That easy quiet is not proof there is nothing to do. It is the opportunity itself, and it is the exact condition that vanishes the moment the crowd finally understands. So here is the last thing I want to leave you with, and it is for the folks who have stayed with me all the way through, because you are the ones who take this seriously. That same free retirement wealth protection guide covers not just protecting a portion of what you build, but protecting what you pass on, the wealth your children and your grandchildren will one day inherit, so that a rule change written in a room you will never see does not quietly rewrite their future too. And for those of you with $100,000 or more in a retirement account who watch this all the way to the end, mention that when you reach out, and you can sit down for a free, no-obligation, one-on-one educational web conference, just you and a real human being, to walk through how any of this might fit your own situation, from our family to yours. If you are watching on your television, scan the QR code on your screen right now. If you are on your phone or your computer, go to readfamilyguide.com. Do it while it still feels early, because early is the only time this decision is ever easy. The safest thing you own is only as safe as the rules that govern it. Generations ago, a whole country of law-abiding savers learned that the hard way, one signature at a time. You do not have to be the one who learns it late. You have the history in front of you, the smart money already showing you its hand, and the door still open. Understand it, hold the real thing, and let someone else be the one who gets set up for the shock.